Hello, good afternoon. I see folks still continuing to trickle in. It's so wonderful to see you all here with us again on this Wednesday. I was going to say morning, but we've clicked over this Wednesday afternoon. So I just really wanted to once again say welcome to all of you, our partners, our friends, our allies in this work towards housing and racial justice. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alina Harway. I'm the Communications Director at the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, NPH, as well as I'm really honored to be supporting the Bay Area Seize the Narrative initiative and table in this work. I'm welcoming you today to part 2 of our 3-part webinar series on the Bay Area Seize the Narrative Playbook, which was the result of our months-long coalition-driven initiative to advance housing and racial justice in the Bay Area. Of course, the playbook isn't the end of this process. It is a really critical milestone, and we're so excited to be working with all of you all to carry it forward to next steps. Last week, we had a session where we dug in deeply on the playbook's recommendations. I think many of you were at that session. For those of you who are new to this session, that's okay. You should have received a copy of that playbook both before last week's session or in this morning's email setting up this session. We can drop it in the chat box as well here. Really, last week's session, we wanted to start the series by really talking through how to apply everything that we have learned so far. We wanted to start with practical recommendations and applications, which is why we unveiled and dug right into the playbook with all of you. We didn't want to hold that back. Of course, as we were reviewing, there were a lot of really great questions about, ooh, what do you mean about that? What did you find? I want to hear more. And that is exactly what today's session is for. We're getting into the nitty gritty on the specific research that we conducted, what they found, what they meant, and how that shaped the recommendations that we reviewed last week. I'm seeing a lot of repeat names in the chat box today, which I'm really excited about. Last week, the chat box was on fire. So I just want to encourage you all to do it again, have us have a really dynamic and engaging session. We're all going to get out of this what we put into it. And last week, you really helped shape, I thought, a really great conversation and QAs that gave us critical questions and discussions that not only informed last week, but really helped shape out how we're talking about today and what next week's session will look like. So let's do that again. For last week, folks, you kind of have a sense of how we're divvying up the chat box and QA. For folks who are new to this series, I want to just review really quickly the tools that we're using. Down at the bottom, if you haven't yet popped open that chat box, you're going to see a little dot saying there's lots of notifications. Go ahead and click that to pop that open. You can see it's going wild here. This is the place to be today to share reactions, feedback, ideas, and make connections with others who are here. In order to really do that, make sure you're chatting all panelists and attendees. Thank you, Landre, my colleague there in the chat box, popping this in before I can even say it. You can see at the bottom, there's a little blue thing that says who you're typing to. If it says all panelists, it means I can see it, Landre can see it, our presenters can see it, but your colleagues will not be able to. So go ahead and click the little button to drop that down and switch it to all panelists and attendees so you can really join in on the conversation here. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't already hopped in to say hi and tell us who you are, please do that at this time. Let you try it out, make sure you got your 2 set up correctly. And it just, there's so many people here from so many different perspectives. And it'd be great if you could say a little bit about who you are, where you're coming from, and what brings you here today and what you hope to get out of this moment. In terms of questions that you have for our panelists, the best way to make sure that those get addressed to offer those questions directly to our researchers is to put that in the other little tool down there that says Q&A. That's where if you put questions that you want addressed about the content of this session, we can make sure that those rise up. As you can see, that chat box is turning over a lot. If you put a question there, we may not be able to see it. So that QA box is really the best place to go to make sure it comes over to us. Lastly, if you run into any technical difficulties, that would be the moment to switch that to all panelists. Go ahead and chat us and we'll see what we can do to help you out. And big shout out and thanks to my colleague Landre Holmes, who's going to be your go-to for those questions and needs. Hi, welcome, Alex and Ingrid and Suzanne and all of you who are coming in and saying hi today. We're so glad to have you here. So today, our session is about the research we conducted in the Bay Area that informed the playbook that we shared last week and are going to be doing work to implement and execute and put into practice. And It's been a real honor to work with this table and this coalition and this initiative to undertake such rigorous and robust approach to the research that informed this. I don't think that our movement has seen research of this scale and size before, and we're really excited to share it with you today. Over the course of the past year, we engaged nearly 2,000 people to really dig in on the promise and possibilities of narrative shift. I'm distracted by the chat box. Hi all, it's really excited to see you. We really knew going into this project that we were at a really opportune moment where our issue had garnered critical support in the shape of affordable housing revenue measures, especially in the Bay Area. If you look at 2015 and 2016 and 2018, there were a number of amazing wins for affordable housing revenue. However, the support in the shape of affordable housing revenue measures had not reached the resonance that we needed to make progress in other areas and the real big, bold solutions we wanted to see. So folks who were turning out to vote yes on these big picture abstract sort of issues aren't turning out in the same way to support the actual creation of affordable homes in their communities or showing up in the same way for tenant protection, speaking up for renters. Not in the number or intensity we need and that this issue deserves anyway. So we were really excited to utilize research as a critical tool in our work to help us assess how to move this forward. We approached the research component of this program with a few clear ideas going in. First, we understood that we really needed it. And I'm going to lean on a video clip for this part of the conversation. Hopefully those audio flubs don't happen again. Y'all will tell me in the chat box if you can hear this as I share my screen and hit play with you.
It's going great. They've been engaging with the platform for about an hour now. They're just starting the Q&A.
Oh, great. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your feelings on the revolutionary new Pied Piper platform. Now, Bernice, you say here that you were totally freaked out by the platform. What specifically totally freaked you out?
Everything. Just every single thing about it.
Just like how it worked.
Now, who else found themselves totally freaked out by this platform? Barry, Warren, Natalie, Martina, Gwen, Amy, Walker, and Clay. You were all totally freaked out. Was anyone not totally freaked out? Clark? Good. What was your reaction?
It just made me feel stupid. This file sync thing is confusing. When I put videos into my main folder, it says it uploaded them, but then I didn't see where they went. It said stuff was on my phone and my iPad, but when I looked at the memory, it said 0K used. So stuff wasn't on there.
That's the platform. He's describing the platform and what's great about it. Well, clearly he doesn't get it. Clearly none of these people get it. Maybe this is a bad group.
This is the 5th one today, and it's the least hostile reaction we've seen.
Okay, well, everyone that I showed the beta to loved it. Loved.
Oh, shit.
What?
Who did you give the beta to? Your friends? Engineers?
Well, yeah, Monica. I wanted to give it to people who would understand what I'm trying to do so I could get useful feedback. And with all due respect, I give it to you, the one person without a computing background, and you said it felt engineered. Oh, shit.
Yeah, you're trying to sell the platform to regular people, but you never actually put it in the hands of regular people. Like them.
Shouldn't there be a download button? Did they honestly forget to add a download button?
We're glad we got that audio figured out. And as folks are saying in the chat box, yeah, that does perhaps feel a little familiar. Sorry, Alex, you're gonna have to watch Silicon Valley on your own time. But yes, that was from the show Silicon Valley. And while they, of course, were talking about a product and selling technology, I think for so many of us, maybe you winced a little bit when you watched this because there was something a little familiar about this. And I think as organizers and advocates, it's something that is really hard to grapple with. And yet we really have to do that and we have to confront that, which is that we are not the base. And that in order to do the work we're trying to do to truly shift minds and hearts at a broad picture, we have to get outside of our bubble. I'm also going to read a quote from Shelter Force, an article written by Miriam Axel Lute earlier this summer. She wrote, "When I attended a presentation at a Facing Race conference on the race class narrative research in 2018, one of the presenters told those assembled, 'You are not the base.' I remember the silence and uncomfortable shifting in the room. we all seem to be thinking, well, who are we then? The answer: people who had come to a conference on race and sought out a session on messaging were mostly people likely to be using racial justice messaging, running campaigns, doing advocacy, or organizing. The base encompasses people in the general public receptive to a certain message and likely to support it. Advocates and organizers, the people who live and breathe a given topic, are their own subcategory. They cannot and should not assume that messages that they respond well to are necessarily going to resonate with others, even a majority of the base. I think both of these clips, the video clip, the clip from the Shelterforce article, are just really important for us to keep in mind that we have to confront our own perceptions and understanding about the world around us. And so we really went into this project realizing that research was critical to our needs to get outside our own minds and bubbles, to learn and unlearn the truths of the people we're trying to reach, to motivate, to engage, and inspire to action. They don't think and feel, they don't breathe and live this issue the way we do. The second thing we really wanted to keep in mind going into the research, and with apologies, EMC, Ruth Bernstein and Dr. T, research can't be it all. It's not the end all be all, and it's not infallible. I think 2016 showed loud and clear what happens if you over rely on polling and opinion research on its own. And we also knew that alone, we also knew that we needed to be making sure that we were really asking the right questions going in, and that we were really hearing the answers and finding the avenues to apply them. So another way of thinking about that I like to think of is that research is the science and analysis and application is the art. And our initiative really said we're going to strengthen both sides of that, science and art. We wanted to hear diverse perspectives, give weight to what we can learn within the reality of our day-to-day work and experiences. So that's all to say, there is a critical role for research and evidence-based learning, as well as making sure that our practitioners in field inform the research approach and goal. That allows us to make sure that we are helping shape the questions so that if we ask the right questions, we can get the right answers. And when we come out of that research with those answers, we can really figure out how to be comfortable putting them into practice. And that is why our Bay Area Narrative Shift Initiative began with practitioner-led discovery. We started exploring best practices, which included Anat Shanker's race class narrative, Dr. Manuel's national research on housing messaging and the backfiring it's caused. We were unpacking cognitive linguistics and messaging best practices. And through that, invited the table and the coalition, many of your orgs, to come help workshop and identify what from there was presenting challenges, what was presenting opportunity. It was that feedback and critical insight that then helped develop our research frame that we wanted to explore. So again, we were assessing what are the questions we're trying to ask in this space, in this moment, in this place, as well as coordinating with state and national narrative research to pull in everything we could learn that was relevant and applicable to our space. Our own research program here in the Bay Area engaged the help of quantitative and qualitative researchers, brought deep expertise in narratives, opinion polling campaigns, and grassroots organizings, and they spoke to thousands of Bay Area residents, primarily using focus groups and polling. And that is where our conversation is going to pick up today. We're going to review the Bay Area Narrative Shift Public Opinion Research Program that was led and is going to be presented by Dr. Tiffany Manuel of the CaseMaking and by Ruth Bernstein of EMC Research. But I just thought it was absolutely critical to acknowledge everything that came before it, as that was so critical in shaping it. So I'll say thank you first to the leadership team and collaborative table who so deeply engaged in shaping, reviewing, workshopping, and refining this research approach. That's East Bay Housing Organizations, East Side Arts Alliance, Pico, California, Working Partnerships USA, and our table ACE, Bar High, Rise Together, Hamilton Families, Housing Leadership Council, Monument Impact, North Bay Organizing Project, Public Advocates, Sacred Heart Community Service, San Mateo Anti-Displacement Coalition, Tech Equity, Urban Habitat, San Francisco Foundation, and the Great Communities Collaborative, and my peers and partners at Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. And then I also would be remiss if I didn't thank you, so many of you who are on the call who have participated, weighed in, workshopped, and provided feedback in other capacities during this process. Your feedback in 2019 and early 2020 really helped shape out this research. Now, let's get into today. We have Dr. Tiffany Manuel, who's the CEO and founder of the CaseMaking, joining us again, as well as Ruth Bernstein, who's the CEO of EMC Research. They're going to share their findings of the Bay Area research program that they conducted for us. Later, we're going to be joined by Will Valverde from M&R, who's going to get us thinking about application ahead. Dr. Manuel what to expect for the rest of the timeline. Dr. Manuel is going to start with an overview of the focus groups, these community listening sessions, and then Ruth is going to walk us through the polling results, including an early lit review of dozens of housing polls that existed, looking for through lines, trends, themes, and contradictions, and then the polling that they executed to values map and help us assess next steps. So there's going to be 2 presentations back to back. After those presentations, that's when we're going to kick it over and have a robust QA session. So please get those questions into the QA box, get the chat firing up to help you, think about what questions you want to put in there, and engage and connect and comment with others. And don't forget that Will from M&R will be joining us later on, so you can put some questions about, application in there as well. Though do note that session 3, which will be next Wednesday, will be another opportunity to dig even deeper to that. So you can think about what kind of questions make sense for today, and know that if we don't get to them today, we'll have opportunities next week as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Tiffany Manuel.
Great, thanks so much, Elena. So happy to join you all again for this session. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk through initial presentation for folks. All right, so good. So hopefully most of you were on the call last week. We talked about the playbook in its entirety, and I wanted to say in the playbook, in the appendix, we sort of walk through at least the list of the sort of arc of the journey, right? A little bit of what Elena just talked about, but also I think specifically a little bit of a list of kind of where the sort of cadence of the research effort across this work. And I would say in the middle of that was some work that we did as part of this project, which was really community voice sessions. So I want to just talk a little bit about those sessions. I won't give the sort of detail of those sessions. I want to leave the majority of the time to EMC. Mostly because I think we haven't heard much from them in terms of the research they have. So I want to do a little bit on the community voice sessions, but leave the bulk of the research descriptions to EMC today. So I wanted to say, to Alina's point, in fact, I have to get that video from the Silicon Valley because that is perfect. It's one of those things where, you have to be careful when you call yourself listening to people, because if you really go out and you listen to folks very carefully, they will tell you the things that sometimes you don't want to hear. But that's a part of the process. So from my vantage point, everything we do at the Case Made is about listening to folks. We not only do the qualitative, but we also do quantitative. But this particular piece about being quiet and really giving people the opportunity to tell you what's important to them is critical if your goal is to pull people forward, which is the thing that we always talk about. How do you get people who may not already understand the importance of affordable housing or homelessness or housing issues, generally speaking, to lean forward when we have these conversations? So, right, a lot of the sort of community voice sessions or the input of that is really about how do you listen to folks and allow them to tell you the things that are important. So we did a series of these community voice sessions across the Bay, some in San Francisco, some in Oakland. They were recruited for us by a professional recruiting firm that got about, that went through about 10 pages of detailed questions to make sure we could get the right set of folks. From our vantage point, we wanted in each of those sessions, I think there were 8 of them, to make sure that we had a really diverse mix of people. So we got strong Republicans and strong Democrats and everybody in the middle, some folks who didn't have any affiliation at all, right? You said independent, I don't know what those parties are doing. In every single session, diversity across the income spectrum, diversity across race and ethnicity, diversity across educational background, diversity, some were homeowners, some were renters, although we did pull out a separate set of sessions just for renters to see if there were some differences in how that conversation was had. We asked for a range of housing situations. So how many folks have been in the Bay Area for a while? How many folks were new? So just some diversity in terms of that. And the only thing I would say that folks directly had in common, every single person, for better or for worse, we decided would be registered voters. And so we had detailed sessions with them, both individualized conversations, and then also these community voice sessions, we brought them together as diverse groups of folks. So what I want to say, when we brought those folks together, let's be clear, we were not listening for whether or not they agreed with this particular idea of affordable housing, or whether they opposed affordable housing, or whether they had their own ideas. That was not the question. We were listening for what was driving their opinions. In other words, all the belief systems, the stuff that's underneath their opinions that got them to the point where they would actually make a decision about whether or not they appreciated affordable housing or appreciated policies or not. And so the first part of those sessions were really about listening for the sort of negative things, the traps. So what are the things that are backfiring every time we say, we think that sounds great, but to the point in that video, you think you're doing a great job, and then you share with folks and they go, what the hell are you talking about? And you go, oh, okay. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a second. We're listening for backpacks, are kind of like small-minded solutions that people would have when they weren't thinking about the expanse or the being transformational on these issues. We're looking for the dominant narratives, things that were causing things to backfire, and we're listening for negative disruptors. Negative disruptors are statements of resignation. So anytime we'd have a conversation that was going really well about what's happening in the Bay and affordable housing and what we can do, and we had that kind of conversation moving. What were the things that just cut through that, the sort of negative disruptors where somebody would say, well, you know, that may be true, but look at homelessness. I mean, we're not solving that. So how can we ever think that we're going to solve affordable housing across the region? Right? And so we're listening for those statements of resignation that would cut through, right, the momentum that we were seeing in the room periodically, so that we would understand what those are to be able to pivot around those. And you'll see that those negative disruptors reflected in the playbook itself. We're also listening for the aha moments. They're like, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. Right? Those were the opportunities to counter some misinformation. Like, are there some things that are dominant that really are not dominant narratives, which means that they're really sort of deeply held, like really deep-seated stuff that it's hard to unlodge, or were they really just beliefs that could be, if we pushed a little bit on them, could actually redirect the conversation. And so we wanted to make sure we had a little bit of that. And then I would say the bulk of the time was spent, for those of you who know my work, you know, there's a whole framework about how you actually make an affirmative case for something. So not just how you navigate around the negative stuff, but how you actually say, these are solutions we want to propose. How do I make an affirmative case for the thing that I believe needs to be done to solve these issues? And so for those of you who know my work, you know that there are really 10 key principles in how you do that. And so we were listening for how much of that did Bay Area folks already get? Like, do they really already have a sense of we around, or a sense of why? So we were listening for, when we talk about this issue around housing, do people start with like personal pronouns, like they personalize this conversation, or was this about those people, right? Is it still us versus them? Or was there a strong sense of we, right? A strong sense of a kind of regional kind of identity that you could, that can become the broad framework for a broader narrative across the Bay. We were listening for things like, do people see this as a systems issue? Are they talking systems? Or are they still talking mostly individualized? This is about people failing to plan for their future and failing to save, and right? So I won't go through all of these. We were listening for whether or not there was enough in the public conversation already where you could build a strong narrative around that. And the purpose of that was to figure out, for the things that were missing, can we get some of that stuff that's missing in the conversation, in our narrative? And for the things that are already there, right, can we build on that? Can we leverage that, right, to move the conversation forward? So having said that, I'll describe, you know, the initial exercise that we always do. We do these sessions all around the country. And any given day, I'm in a different city doing some of these sessions on a variety of different issues. Housing is just one of them. But we always start with this question about, you know, if you could get all the policymakers in the Bay Area, all the policymakers at the state level who have an impact on the quality of your life, or even at the national level, your, you know, congressional reps and your senators and the president and the governor and onward. And you could sit them down and give them the 3 big issues that you care about. What would those issues be? And mostly the reason we ask those questions is because we want to see if housing shows up among them. Because when people come to these sessions, they don't know why they're coming. They're only told that they're coming to a session that's about community. It's about how we think about the community and what's happening, right, in the world. So I will say, you know, one of the things that was most surprising for us, it should be no surprise to you all, but we wanted to check to make sure that it was true, that when you ask that question, consistently in the Bay Area, people talk about housing, like within number 1 or number 2 at the top level, like that's a big animating concern. So you all are not in a position of having to convince anybody that housing is an important, relevant concern. That's not your issue. I can tell you, I do this again all across the country, and you'd be surprised how many places where housing doesn't even show up, in places where there are large crises happening, And so it was significant, right, that when we got to the Bay, that was not the issue. However, there were lots of other issues, and I won't go through all this. I just will say there were lots of, I would say, surprising findings that came out of those sessions. One, the conversation about housing was very viral. People were eager to talk about housing and they wanted to have the conversation. But what I would say is that conversation is consistently stuck in the wrong place. It's stuck in this conversation where people trading stories about how bad is it? Oh, let me tell you, I pay $2,300 for a one-bedroom apartment. Oh man, this guy he brought this tear down for him. Oh yeah, and so it was like stuck in this conversation about how bad is it. And the problem is not that people didn't have a consciousness about the fact that this is probably really bad, but also that the conversation didn't graduate. It didn't on its own like move to the next level, like, what do we do about it? Or, well, I heard that Senator so-and-so is doing, it never made that sort of graduation. And so a part of what we were listening for was, then how were people having that conversation? What did that look like when they kind of got there? So, yeah. So I want to say just a couple things here. So as we're thinking about this, there were a couple things that came up consistently as being negative disruptors. Things like homelessness consistently became part of a challenge around, as they were talking through these issues, whenever homelessness came up, it was a negative disruptor. And it was used as a way to remind people that we can't possibly be successful because look at what's happening in homelessness, the drugs and the crime. And so it was used as a way to cut through the urgency and agency around housing. Same thing with this conversation about high wages and compensation, used as a way to sort of cut through some of these issues. So I would say I won't go through all of this, but I would say just at a high level, some of the real surprising findings were things like loss aversion, which we always look for. What are people afraid to lose? Across the country, we can say that people are afraid to lose their nurses, their essential workers, their et cetera. That was not a conversation that people had. In fact, people said, no, we're not afraid to lose folks, but they were afraid to lose their children, who they perceived as moving away. They were afraid to lose small businesses, the sort of, small stores and, bookstores and things that dot the landscape. They were afraid to lose their own kind of economic security, that they felt like they were falling behind. They were afraid to lose their financial future. So you could see the things that people were afraid to lose. And I always say in the work that we do, if you don't know what people are afraid to lose, you don't have what you need to pull them forward, right? Because that's the stuff that keeps them up at night. And so we got a sense of hearing people talk about the things that they're afraid they're going to lose if we don't solve for housing as an issue. So I won't go through this. I'll make sure that the PowerPoint remains available to folks if you want to see it. But that was the conversation. What are some of those things that people are just challenged by when they think about housing as an issue? Housing, they talked about it as a systems issue, but as a cause. But when you got to solutions, it was all individualized solutions. We can talk about why that is. When people did talk about affordable housing in this really first-person sense, it was all about their life course events. So when I retire, I have to think about affordable housing. When I get married, when I'm having a baby. So those life course events really force people to grapple with the availability or not of affordable housing, and or issues of for developers and other folks. Let me just check and make sure. I'm gonna go into a video now. Let me just check just 1 second. I think you were saying, Alina, you were saying something about the audio. So let me just check. Alina, is the audio okay for folks?
You're all good. Thank you.
It's good? Okay. All right, let me go. I just, especially when we get to the video, I don't want people to miss that part of it. So, okay, I'm gonna keep going. Let's see. Okay. So lastly on this part, the thing I wanted, there are two other big things I wanted to describe. One was this issue of people displacing the issue to government, and this conversation about government being flush with cash kept coming up. The government doesn't need it. We've given them so much money. In a country where money solves everything, why can't they use our tax dollars and solve this? That was a huge animating part of these conversations in the Bay Area. And again, it's important because if that's the public conversation, our ability to either navigate around that or address it is really important. There was less stigma around affordable housing, but also no sense that people felt like any affordable housing was really going to help them. So they didn't feel like a personalized, if this happens, my life is going to be better because of it. And finally, I would say the most curious finding that came out of that to me was there was a study, I haven't seen this in any other part of the country, but like this kind of dystopia of romanticizing the idea that the tech bubble would burst, the economy would go flat, and then people would have housing. Like when we ask people, like, what do you think could really transform the Bay Area and solve for what we're seeing, they start imagining these like dramatic scenarios, almost like, I hate to say it, but almost maybe what we're having right now, but they start, you know, like romanticizing, like, well, I mean, the tech bubble burst, and then the housing market would open up again, and then the economy would sink, and then we'd have access, right, to the stock of affordable housing that right now is out of our reach. And so, you know, just as a curious kind of issue, I haven't seen that in any other part of the country except for the Bay, and it was one of the things that was surprising in those conversations. I will also say we did this with renter-only groups. And the only thing I say about this is just that, you know, the renter-only groups were, I think, much more sympathetic, obviously, to the issues of renter stability. They were less stigmatizing and kind of open to, like, what would it look like if we were really to take on this issue of housing in a different way. But I will say that, you know, a lot of them talked about, like, they didn't know what a renter movement would look like. And we asked, like, what would it look like if we kind of came together around a shared sense of what's happening in the Bay Area? What would that look like? And they said, I don't even know what that, like, what would we do? Like, what would we focus on? Which was extraordinary, because I know a lot of your organizations are working really hard on that. But there was really kind of the lack of the imagination of, like, well, what would we advocate for? Like, what would we, like, that kind of conversation. The good news about that is they were open to it. They just didn't understand and limited to how they would envision it. The other thing I'd say is, you all know this, folks are juggling so many jobs and so many things, just trying to stay afloat, that they didn't have a whole lot of patience for the high-minded work of activism and advocacy. They're like, listen, I'm just trying to, like, I got 4 jobs, or I got 5 jobs, and I got this to do, and I got that to do. I don't have time to be out here, you know, right, protesting and things like that. And so there was that kind of conflict between where I am today and the issue of whether I should be advocating on these issues. And for a lot of them, they talked about saying things like, listen, my activism is I'm staying here. I'm staying put. I'm not leaving. I'm not letting the circumstances run me out of the Bay Area. And that for them was a defiant act. And so, you know, I would say for those folks who are thinking about or working around sort of mobilizing renters, those are both chief concerns and issues, but also opportunities that can be opened up to do that. So I thought that I would play just a little bit of just one of the sessions, just so you could hear just some of the comments that came, that some of those surprising findings I just shared with you. You could hear folks talk about that, so you can hear people talk about that in their own words. It's about a 3-minute video or so where we just go through a couple clips, just one of the sessions. So just sit tight and I'll just enjoy or listen, I would say, to some of the folks in the focus group. Very similar to what Alina just played for Silicon Valley. Go through some of this. All right.
It is very expensive, but I feel like, unfortunately, at this point, I'm like highway hypnotized by it. It's like I'm unfazed by it. It's just what it is. It's abnormal to my friends or family who come into town. But it's like, oh, $30 for a burger? Yeah. $20 for a drink? I'm like, yeah, that's what it costs. Like, it's unfortunate, but that's totally normal to me at this point.
And I find the upcoming neighborhood, so it wasn't the best, but it is now. Yeah. So I got very lucky. I mean, I just made the right choices.
But the other way to look at it is, because we have a house already, we're making the mortgage. We're not making it by all means like we're doing well, but at least we each have one job. We're not making, we're not doing 2 or 3 jobs. And because we're somewhat making it with some kind of smart choices in life, it's like having something that everyone else wants and you have it. It's kind of hard to give it up.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think tell my kids, you don't understand how lucky you are that you can bring Spam Masubi to school and eat seaweed and no one's gonna make fun of you.
Again, another $300 million is sitting there.
No, well, that's the, I mean, the city's not short of money. I mean, one of the things of being like a tech centre is it's a wash in cash for the population, but it's functional. I mean,
First of all, there's no shortage of first responders. Okay, we have allocated and we pay them handsomely, and I think deservedly so. I'm not going to dispute that in any way, shape, or form, especially with the nurses. So, I mean, that's just a complete fallacy, and there's no way that they're going anywhere. I mean, they make hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I want to make sure I'm here because you're all saying something different than I've heard before, so I want to make sure I'm capturing it. So you all don't think that the city is losing any of these folks that we really need? Is that not right?
First responders, nurses, etc.
Anybody, I mean, are you losing the people? I mean, you're losing the teachers, poor people that you need or not?
They're just
Local
commuting.
people?
Yeah, exactly. They're just commuting.
Let me just be clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're working in the city and they're just commuting. They just live somewhere else.
They're traveling from Tennessee or Turlock or wherever.
Yeah, most of the time they, own in Sacramento or, somewhere else, and then they commute to the city.
I have coworkers that commute 2 hours, no, 4 hours. 2 hours one way.
And it's really no big deal because normally they just do like, a 48-hour shift and then they're off for several days.
if somebody's a janitor and suddenly the janitors can't live here, then you just pay more for the janitor.
Yeah,
You just say, I need a janitor, and it's going to cost me 200 grand to get a janitor in this place, I'll pay it.
Experience the teachers I know in the Bay Area, and I'm in San Francisco, some San Francisco school district, they make over 100K and they don't work full time. So if you take how much they make a year divided by how many hours they actually work, it's a very big.
Totally. So I don't want to like gouge people, but then I'm like, well, I want to make my mortgage, but I'm like, oh, I can get more money, but then I'm like, I don't want to do that to them because I wouldn't want someone to do that to me. So it's just kind of it's a tough situation.
I don't know. I almost feel like it's like a label. Like everybody thinks that all the techies live here, and that's not true. I mean, there's a lot of us locals that grew up here. I'm not a techie, and I feel like I want to stay just because all these techies moved in. They're not going to push me out because they moved in and they make, way more than I make. It's almost like a battle. That's just how I feel.
That's why I'm here, and that's why, one of my biggest fears though is if this thing keeps progressing in the way it is, and my kids might not be able to live here. Then I might not see them. You know what I mean? So that's one of the reasons why I think some changes need to happen.
I'm also worried, like, for the future, it's like how my kids would want to live in this area if they could even afford to do that.
Okay.
I think small businesses get hurt because they can't get people to work for them, like at the coffee shops or the restaurants.
And then
like
when I
that.
need to pay $10 for a cup of coffee, I'm not gonna go pay $10 for my own coffee.
I mean, so that's why it all filters down as well. Like I around everywhere, and I'm wondering like how does other people live here? Because I feel the pinch as well. It's like so I think about all those things.
Businesses shutting down because their rent goes up. So you've got somebody's had a 10-year lease at, I don't know, $2 grand a month, and the person that owns the building wants to sell it to developers, and they want it vacant. So they go, it's not $2 grand a month, it's 10 grand a month. And so, if it's a restaurant or a store or something, they move out, that place is vacant. You see a lot of vacant buildings in downtown because the owners are hoping that a developer will come along and buy it to turn into condos or whatever.
I'm in the same boat. Like my family's here, but as soon as my kids get to college age, I want to abandon ship and move somewhere where it's not maybe a little more relaxing or remember my older years.
So I'm gonna stop that video there. And some of the things that I hope that you saw in that video were, I try to pull some of those places where you see some of the language in the playbook directly try to push back on some of that stuff. So this whole conversation at the very beginning of people talking about they're lucky, it's funny that the Bay Area was the first place where I think we started really listening in for that language. now we're hearing it all over the country, which is really interesting. But the Bay was the first place where we heard it so often. Like we thought, what the hell is going on? That conversation about I have to be lucky. It's for those of you who are on Housing California's Unconference. I talked about that like this politics of lucky. People are like, well, I was lucky because I'm renting from this place and I have this friend of mine, and or I was really lucky. I found this like rent control apartment, or oh well, I was really lucky because I bought in the Bay. And it's like, well, that's great, but like you shouldn't have to be lucky, right? We should leave the survival of so many folks to chance or to luck. Like we need our systems to operate better so everybody gets a chance to have a great place to live. And so, in the playbook itself, under the counter, where there are places to counter some of the conversation that is not going well, you'll see us directly try to get at that, because that is a conversation that is viral. It often pervades the sort of narrative that people are talking about. And it's not, and we found that when we push back on that, people didn't bristle. Like some of the dominant narratives are so strong that when you push back on them, people try to fight you on them. But that was one of the ones we could push back on and enforce people to say, yeah, well, I guess that's true. That doesn't make any sense. Yeah, doesn't make any sense. And so we give some examples of like, you shouldn't have to be lucky to do that. But I hope you also see the resonance of some of the other things in the playbook that we're pushing back on. They had a robust conversation about businesses, and they were concerned about business shutting down. But when you talked about like essential workers, like nurses or teachers, they push back because, they make a high salary. Those folks are making big wage. They're not leaving them. So there was this conversation that normally works on affordable housing, other parts of the country about essential workforces and, that kind of thing. In the Bay Area, we didn't find that to be particularly helpful because people push back because teachers are making, look how much these teachers are making, and look how, even the janitors, if you need a janitor, you just pay like, 10 times what the janitors make and they stay. We're not losing anybody. And so, the thinking about what people are afraid to lose, they weren't afraid to lose that, but there were some other things they were afraid to lose. So pull that forward. And you'll see in the playbook where we try to get at some of those things they're afraid to lose. The future of their children, they're afraid to lose these small businesses, they're afraid to lose their own financial footing. Those are the places where you can see some of that. So I won't go through most of that. I will just say that the playbook, even in the descriptions, we have a little description in each one of those sections around what we heard in some of those community voice sessions, why it's important that we either counter some of that or amplify some of what we heard or pivot around it, and then give you a little bit of sample language for you to take on and just kind of, massage in the way that is best for the work that you do. So I'm just going to say, all of that informed, all those community voice sessions informed the strategy that's in the playbook. And so as you read through there, you see some of that as being totally resonant. So I'm going to stop and say, I hope that you'll take another look at the playbook, both the rationale for why the language is what it is, and also some of the sample language that can help you get up and over, I think, some of the findings that we found in the playbook. And I'm happy to talk about some of the other findings at the end if people want to come back around for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this moment and turn it over to Ruth, who's going to talk about the polling results from EMC's research.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. It has really been fabulous working with Dr. T and the whole table. Thank you so much to all the funders who have chipped in for this work, and a really special thank to NPH, who we've been working with for a number of years, and it really has been a lot of fun, actually, on all the stuff that we've been doing. And this particular, so what I'm going to talk about today, really stepping back a little, we started this project with stepping back and looking at what do we know so far. And like we've been polling here in the Bay Area for over 30 years. We didn't go all the way back that far, but pulling together what research we did have available, what are some of the big picture things that we learned from that we feel like were important. And then also we did conduct a big quantitative survey of voters. We did, I think we heard from about a little over 1,300 respondents. We did the survey in May of this year, and we really got into kind of values and messages and things like that. So I'm going to take you through all that. We're going to start really big and then kind of get into the detail. And my colleague Emily Goodman is on as well. She is able to answer some of the questions live and real time as we go through this. And then of course I can answer questions at the end. So, all right, as I said, very big picture here. So one of the big pictures, and some of these things are so incredibly obvious, but for those of us that are steeped in this all the time and working in this, we need to kind of step back, as we saw in the focus group video that Alina showed us at the very beginning from Silicon Valley. So big picture, the issue of housing is complex and also super personal, deeply personal. So first, the overall, the terminology, when people read about the issue of housing, it's confusing. There are all these different words and language, and I could probably talk for 2 hours just on the issue of housing versus affordable housing. I won't do that, but just, you know, the overall, the terminology that people use is just very confusing to people. And then also, there's no common visualization around what housing is. So when we say housing, we all have a different version of that in our own minds. We have a different version of what home means, of what a safe home means. We all have a different picture. And so when we talk to people about, oh, we want to build more housing in your neighborhood, or we want to put this kind of housing or these kind of homes, what we see in our own minds might not be what they see in their minds. And people have a very hard time visualizing something that doesn't exist right now, that doesn't exist right in front of them. And so, you know, and also what people value and what they think is, you know, what quality may be very different, right? For some people, it's a single family home way out in the suburbs with a swimming pool. For some people, it's multi-unit urban. Also, again, incredibly obvious, but incredibly important. Housing does not exist in its own issue vacuum. It has a lot of other things, and we've talked about this quite a bit last week about housing is just not alone. So when you talk about housing, housing creates more traffic, or maybe it reduces traffic. It affects, people think that it brings down, building more housing might bring down the cost of housing. It might increase the cost of housing. It brings up needs for schools. It takes away open space, potentially. It doesn't always, but sometimes people think that. They think maybe it brings more crowding. But it's also, there's the good side. It can create jobs. It can get people closer to their workplace. It can decrease their commute time. So housing is not an issue it's not alone. It's not just a thing on its own. And again, these seem obvious, but sometimes we forget that when we get into our communication. Also, again, an issue that I could talk about for hours is the difference is that homelessness and housing and homelessness are interrelated but complicated. For many voters or residents in the Bay Area, they don't think that homelessness is simply about housing. As you can see here, what do you think is the biggest reason people are homeless? We know that this is not the only thing, but this is what people said. They say something like mental health or drug abuse, and so it's very complicated. Then housing continue, as Dr. T talked about, that Bay Area residents know that housing is a top concern. It continues to be a top concern, but we are also very aware that things might change. I'm already seeing in polling that we're doing, obviously in the time of COVID, the concern about housing is going down. So even just here, a poll that we did in the Bay Area in May of 2019, 24%, this is what is the most important problem facing the Bay Area today, and people could say anything, and 24% said housing or affordable housing, another 10% said homelessness, 5% said cost of living, 39% total mentioned something about that. Notice down here, economy and jobs, only 5% mentioned something about that in May of 2019. Then in a very recent poll, August 2020, same Bay Area voters, COVID, no surprise, is at the top, 27%, housing only 17%, homelessness 14%, and now we see economy and jobs is up a little, 8%. In other polling, I'm seeing that housing, has been dropping in intensity. So we will see. It definitely continues to be a top concern, but we have to recognize that the environment is changing, and we'll especially see what happens with the economy. But we were seeing, you know, when we did this review pre-COVID, definitely there is concern and a lot of concern about, so I am concerned about finding an affordable place to live in the Bay Area for myself. In 2017, it was only 58% agreed with that. In just 2 years, it jumped to 65%, and the intensity went up to 48% strongly agree. And then when we asked about what about a friend or family? Are you worried about a friend or family finding? It was over 8%, or sorry, 80%. It was over 80% thinking a friend or family would have a hard time finding a place to live. Also related to, you know, thinking about housing justice and the whole purpose of what we're trying to do here, that we're trying to create a Bay Area where everyone can live and everyone can have a place they call home. We wanted to just step back and show you a couple things about what do people think about living in the Bay Area now. So in an open-ended question, what's the best thing about living here? The weather. So the weather comes to the top, but right after that, the second response is the diversity, the culture, the accepting environment, the having all kinds of different people, 21%. And then of course, you know, there's a lot to do, activities and all that. And we see huge acceptance of wanting diversity. So there should be affordable places to live for all people, whether white, black, brown, or in all parts of the Bay Area. 80% agree with that statement, 51% strongly agree. There should be affordable places to live for all people in my neighborhood, whether white, black, or brown, in my neighborhood. Agreement with that statement as well, almost exactly the same. So it's not just about, and you know, obviously people know maybe what the right answer is here, but still very strong agreement. And then having people from different races and income levels is part of what makes the Bay Area a great place to live. 76% agree with that. So the housing is a concern, and being able to maintain and improve the diversity in our in the Bay Area and in our neighborhoods is very important to Bay Area residents. There is support for change. It might not feel like that sometimes when you are out there doing this work. Especially after we, you know, listening to the focus groups that Dr. T showed you, and I've done a lot of this work as well. And, you know, sometimes you feel like, oh, we are not going to get people to move, but we have seen change. So this question, I support the building of new housing in my neighborhood. In 2014 in the Bay Area, only 15% strongly agreed with that statement, 56% somewhat agreed. And it's, you know, this is not just about building in your neighborhood, but we are seeing a pretty significant shift on this question over time. As you can see here, going from 2014 to 2019 in a short period of time, only 5 years, we go to 35% strongly agree, 64% total agree that they support new housing in their neighborhood. So just fundamentally, we are seeing a shift in attitude, and it means that, you know, and this is without having an overarching narrative that's trying to change opinions, and we're seeing more receptivity. We also see, of course, support for the 3 Ps. So when asking about preservation, production, and protection, 82% of voters in the Bay Area support preservation, 80% support production, 63% support protection. Protection is a little bit more controversial because renters are very supportive, homeowners are somewhat less supportive, but overall these concepts we see support throughout the region. And then on this issue, there are significant contradictions in opinion. This is something, you know, we see both, we show it quantitatively, we hear it qualitatively, as Dr. T talked about in her groups. She has experienced this as well. People contradict themselves right up. So 82% say they're concerned about housing for others, but only 61% support housing in their neighborhood. And I've heard it, you know, sitting in focus groups with people where they're saying, you know, housing is so important. I mean, we really need more places for people to live. You know, they should build more housing over there. in another city. You know, I'm supportive. They say, you know, I'm supportive of doing this, but you know, it'll never get approved here. So, you know, they're not willing always to stand up for the thing they believe in, or they really just do contradict themselves. You know, again, also sort of a gap in the overall terminology. I support policies that make it easier to build new housing in transit and commercial areas. 68% agree. On the same poll, I support building new higher density housing in my neighborhood. Those are essentially kind of similar things, but only 37% agree with higher density. And this is, again, the terminology matters a lot. We're talking about housing in transit and commercial areas. We see that's popular. The word density tends to not be popular. Attitudes about what my neighborhood is or what is near a transit or commercial area get people confused, and that we have to really be careful about the words we use overall. And so on that, looking at words, so one of the things we've been seeing in our research overall is that when communicating about who benefits, and again, this seems so obvious, who benefits far outweighs the process and the mechanics. So when we focus on the outcomes, the people that it's going to benefit, the people that are going to live in housing, or the people that can stay in their housing, seniors or veterans or disabilities, teachers, as we saw, teachers, sometimes this can be controversial because sometimes people think, oh, those people get paid plenty of money, but that when we talk about actual people and the outcomes of the families that get to stay, the reduced traffic and congestion if you don't have to be commuting, that you can live closer to where you work, you can see your family more often, we can make sure that our children can continue to live here and that they won't get squeezed out. Let's focus on people and the outcomes, as opposed to talking about the process. When we get into the process of talking about like the percentage of affordable housing units or the number of units or height limits or gentrification, that's when it becomes much more controversial, more confusing, and we are talking about the bricks and mortar as opposed to the people. When we can talk about the people and we can paint a picture about what we're trying to do, we see more support overall. And then I think what's most important and really leads into the playbook is that effective communications have to meet people where they are. Over time, we are hoping that we're going to see some shift in overall attitudes, but still we need to understand where people are and try to meet them, because we're going to be more likely to shift them if we're meeting them in their own place. So we did as I said, we did a large quantitative survey, and it was a very different kind of survey. It was all online so that people could actually see things. And we focused a lot on starting with a series of values and trying to understand where people are on these values. We then showed them some messages, and then we asked again about some of the values to see if any of the messaging moved their values. And one of the important things about values is that frequently they don't change. It's where people are. It's fundamentally what's important to them. So there was a series of statements and they were asked, and people could put themselves on a scale. So for instance, on the top one, having a decent place to live is a privilege, not a right, versus having a decent place to live is a human right. We can see a lot of agreement on that. They could put themselves on a 0 to 100 scale. The average score was 68. But it comes kind of the top value or agreed upon value in the Bay Area. Having a decent place to live is a human right. So all of these together, when we go through and break them up, the values that have broad appeal in the Bay Area, throughout the Bay Area, having a decent place to live is a basic human right. I support building more housing, even in my neighborhood. Housing policy can make a significant difference and help to control the cost of housing regardless of the economy. And like public education and healthcare, everyone should have access to housing. Those are all not 100% universal, but it is where we see a lot of agreement throughout the Bay Area. Some that are kind of more limited is I prefer a mix of renters and tenants and homeowners in my neighborhood. Housing policy should be focused on an area's future needs, and everyone should be able to live wherever they want. So, and this is something we've seen in qualitative work as well, the issue of everyone should be able to live where they want. There is not, we see, you know, some people are just saying, look, if you have to, you know, if you have to commute, you have to commute. That's the way things are. So we see less agreement on that concept of everyone should be able to live where they want. And then frames that had kind of more, and I see lots of stuff going on in the chat, but I'm not looking at it well, just so you know, I can't wait to see all the questions at the end. And then the value frames that really don't resonate, for very many, they're not great for us. We need housing policy in the Bay Area that makes up for decades of unfair treatment of people of color. There's enough space in the Bay Area for everyone who wants to live here. That value is really not. A lot of people feel like it's just already too crowded here. And then home ownership is unnecessary to achieve long-term personal economic success. The reverse of that tends to be more true, that many people in the Bay Area think that homeownership is important for achieving long-term personal economic success. So that really is not a message frame that works great for us. And then what we saw is that, as I said, values and attitudes are difficult to shift because that's what people's values, they really hold them. I'm not gonna, they hold them close to that, so it's harder to change. I'm not going to talk through all these numbers. Basically, what we did is we had as I said, we had a series of values. We then showed some messaging, and then we asked again and looked to see whether there was a difference. So did the messaging create any difference? And you can see we actually didn't see a whole lot of change both before and after the messaging. And then we did a logistic regression and basically crossing the message statements with the value frames. And so we weren't just looking at what messages are the best, that rank the best, but actually which ones using regression were actually showing a positive relationship to match up with the values. And what we saw, and I'm not expecting you to know, this is just, I'm just showing you kind of our process here. But where we came out, and you're gonna see all this in the playbook, some of the top messaging. So, again, this is kind of everything we've learned comes into creating these messages, and then we test them, and they actually do seem like they resonate a lot. So the big one, and Dr. T has talked about this a lot as well, is kind of the legacy. With a safe, stable place to call home, our children, so we're personalizing it, our children have a better chance of succeeding in school, getting a job, and building their own strong families here in the Bay Area. We owe it to our children, the next generation, to make sure that there is enough housing for them to stay in the communities where they were raised if they choose to. That came up kind of very high universally, and again, it kind of brings together all those messages about talking about the outcomes, talking about the benefits, talking about the people who it's going to benefit. It's not talking about the policy or the bricks and mortar. The Bay Area thrives because of the diversity of our communities here. Rising rents and home prices affect everyone. They have an especially hard impact on people of color and those working low-paid jobs, many of whom are being forced out of the region. We need to act so that all of us, white and Black, Latinx and Asian, Indigenous and newcomer, can stay in this unique place we all love. I think that comes out of showing when we saw that diversity is so important for the people in the Bay Area, that this message really makes sense. It really resonates for folks. And then the lucky, many homeowners in the Bay Area got lucky. We've all heard that a million times. They bought their homes when it was still relatively affordable to do so, but today the price of renting or owning a home makes both options unaffordable to many who currently live here. Policy that preserves and protects housing options for renters and homeowners across the region means that more of us can be lucky. So it's taking the lucky that people talk about and saying everyone should be able to be lucky. And then you can read, there's also the aspirational message that, it's a foundation for families, health, that, it's never been clear that safe, stable housing is critical, especially during COVID. So these messages, as you can see, again, they're talking about outcomes, they're talking about feelings, they're connecting with people's values, and and that it moves them emotionally rather than trying to go to the logic and the bricks and mortar and all of the policy details. So I think that was the end. I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Alina to manage our Q&A process.
Yeah, thank you so much to both Dr. T and Ruth for sharing that. And I know that that was a lot. And I'm seeing in the chat box and the QA, there are a lot of questions and conversations. And we're going to be able to get into a lot of this. We've got a nice QA period. And then also I would just encourage you all to put your questions in there even as we're going. If we don't have time to address all of it today, we'll make time to, incorporate those questions and feedback and ideas as this project continues to move on, because the playbook is not the final product. This research, which informed the playbook, is not the end of this. This is a work in progress, and we're going to have to keep working together to build this out. So Ruth, please come back, and Dr. T, if you could please come back as well. I want to help. I want to help share some of these questions that are coming up in the chat box and get your perspectives on this. And then I'll flag for all of our attendees that we also do have Will Valverde from M&R here. So if you have questions around application of some of this research, feel free to put some of those QA in there as well, because we'll bring him on a little bit later. So I'm going to actually start with one of our earliest questions. It's this big, broad question from Thea, who asked if you can talk about what the research says about differences between how people think about housing, affordable housing, and homelessness. And the reason I want us to start here is because that's a great question in and of itself, but really to unearth sort of the way maybe we think about these things and the way the general public is thinking about how things do and don't interconnect. It just would be great to get both of your perspectives on that. And maybe let's start with Ruth, because you had some specific slides about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things is that people don't understand what affordable housing is. So we toss around and use the term affordable housing, and I think what most people are hearing is housing that is affordable for me, right? And that's an important distinction. A capital A affordable, a capital H housing is very different than housing that's affordable for me. And we are seeing a shift that more and more people, we think, are starting to understand that affordable housing is actually a policy, is a thing. But even under affordable housing, there's confusion because different communities have different levels of who can get in and who's accepted. So I think that to me is one of the most important issues, is that affordable housing is not a term that people really, it's not unique. I mean, it's not one thing. And that if you ask someone, we asked a survey a couple of years ago, we said, what percentage of housing do you think should be affordable? And people said 100%, because it should be affordable for me. And homelessness, I think is a whole different issue in many, many ways. And although we know that housing first is an important policy, and that without housing and without a stable place to call home, you can never solve or address homelessness. But I think for many residents, they see the issue as two very different issues. Many think that, that you have to address, obviously, the other issues that are related, and that such as mental health, substance abuse, violence in the home, job stability, all of the other issues that are related, that it's not just about housing. Much more complicated, I think. And Dr. T, I'm sure you have stuff to add there as well.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that, Ruth. I think that's exactly right. When people think about homelessness, they think first and foremost that it's not necessarily about housing. They think of it as a public health threat, right? So something's wrong with them, and that's why they're out there. Otherwise, there are plenty of programs that people can go to, or plenty of shelters and other things that are available for folks if they don't want to be in an unsheltered situation. And when you say homelessness, that's what they think of. They don't think about people couch surfing and, right, they don't think about housing instability. They think about people literally living on the street. What's interesting about that, I would say nationally, that sort of frame out of being a public health threat is consistent. But I would say in the Bay Area, there are two other things that really I think, put a finer point on that when we did the community voice sessions. One, it wasn't just that it was about a public health threat. In the Bay Area, it was deeply associated with criminal activity. So now you've got something that you want people to be thinking about in a very constructive way. They totally moving in the direction of, this is criminal activity, call the police, right? All of that negative, I would say, framing around that. And so we got a lot of very passionate response in those sessions around criminalizing behavior versus let's be really empathetic that people are experiencing this, whatever is happening to them in terms of homelessness. That's a real big challenge, I would say. Now that it's kicked over into that sector, or that part of the public imagination, now this gets really much harder. So we got to be very careful about that. And I would say also, because of that, and another issue, in the community voice sessions, we also got people using homelessness as kind of the negative disruptor. So whenever you get a conversation about affordable housing as being particularly helpful, or this could be good for us, somebody would come into that conversation, cut in and say, well, I mean, look at what's happening in homelessness. And it was an example of, look at what's happening and look at all the good we could do with affordable housing. It's, well, we can't even solve this. People defecating on the street, and drug needles and syringes. And so if we can't solve that, how do you think we could ever solve, you know, the housing issues across the Bay? It can't happen. And so what I would say to you is that just be very careful, because homelessness is now in the public consciousness sort of used as a way to remind themselves that this is really not possible for us to make a change. The last thing I'll say about that is, you know, homelessness and affordable housing are directly related. We on this call know that, and the public imagination, there is that gap. And I would say that across the country and the places where I work, folks are having to make a very painful and strategic decision about whether or not to link those two things in the public imagination and to go out in a coordinated fashion, talking about affordable housing and talking about homelessness. I don't know that you all have had to grapple with that, but I do know that has been, I've worked in communities where they have said, we can't at this moment take on homelessness. It's too hard. We see some opportunities in affordable housing where we're going to dispatch that other piece of it because we can't take both of those on. And I would say it's very painful because they're totally related. You can't, but they're making those short-term political decisions. I don't have any judgment about that except to say that how we handle this issue of homelessness and how we think about it and frame it as part of a larger trajectory around what's happening in housing needs to be done very, very carefully, especially in the Bay, given how it's been used.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. And I know we could talk on that issue for another 2 hours, but let me hop into some of the other questions. Actually, a number of folks asked variations of this, so I will just ask you both, can you give a just quick review of who it was that you spoke with in your research in terms of who was polled, who was in those focus groups, and then specifically there were questions about who was not in the space. So speaking specifically to like what income levels were and were not tested, English speakers, non-native speakers. Could you both say a little bit about who you spoke with and how those decisions were made?
You want to go first, Ruth?
Yeah, I was just actually looking up the specific answer. So the overview of the research that the big picture overview incorporated all kinds of different research. So most of it has been voters, although not all of it. Some of it has been, so in the kind of overview, some of it has actually been inclusive of non-voters as well. Much of it, anything that we do most of the work we do in the Bay Area is multilingual. I'm just looking at, and it's usually representative of, so for the quantitative work was representative of voters. We decided, because we were talking ultimately about policy change, that we would use a survey of randomly selected voters. And so obviously the voting population in the registered voters in the Bay Area is actually a very high percentage of residents are registered to vote. And this was inclusive of all registered voters. So, you know, it does include people on various ends of the income spectrum and age spectrum, but obviously there's always, in quantitative research, we potentially do underrepresent some people on the margins, because it's meant to be representative of the broader population.
Yeah, and so I would say, so we complement each other very well. I would say the qualitative research is not meant to be terribly representative. We're not trying to have each of those community voice sessions directly represent the proportion of the population. The opposite is true for us. We're trying to get as much diversity in the room at one time as we can, so that when we hear certain frames that seem to be working, if they're not working for other kinds of groups, we want to know that like right away, right? So we want to see the pushback and the push and pull across different types of groups. And we also want to see different perspectives, different groups of people negotiate, manage, fight, agree, about some of these issues, because we're listening for, in those qualitative sessions, who has the right to speak? What kind of arguments win the day? Like who feels empowered to talk about their circumstances versus others? Like what kind of arguments, when they buttress each other, win the day? What kind of arguments are able to win over other folks? I hate to say it, but what happens when the bullies in the room, come out with strong statements that are really unfortunate? Do other folks who have alternative views sort of cower in that moment, or what are the kind of things that pull that conversation back? Can you drop different kinds of ideas in that kind of conversation and pull some folks forward, but maybe not others? So it's a different kind of conversation, but it's meant to represent that diversity, even if folks are not as, may not be as represented in the population. So as I said before in my presentation, we use a professional recruiting firm to make sure we got that as much diversity in the room as we could possibly get. I will say the place we probably fell down the most was just on, all of the sessions were conducted in English. So for folks who were non-English speakers, that was a big deterrent. So we didn't have that kind of diversity in the room. So that was, I would say, probably the things that probably sort of keep me up at night about who was left out of that conversation. It's that. Yeah, and the other thing I would say probably for the Bay would be and I grapple with this every time we do these sessions. I usually give the ultimate decision to the folks I'm working with, but about whether you want to have every single person who walks in the door be a registered voter or not. Some folks think that that's really important because that's a kind of like base measure of somebody who's likely to walk into a polling place and like pull a lever. In other places, they want to be more, generative, like there's a large population of folks who may not be registered, but who could be. So what would pull those folks in? In this particular work, I would say all the folks who walked in our room were registered voters. And so that's always the part of the challenge. Like what about those folks who may not feel the inclination or the enfranchisement and empowerment to vote? So that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, I think, what I'm being reminded of hearing you both speak is not every single research tool we used spoke to everybody, but right. Different research tools spoke to diverse perspectives and populations and income levels and language and voters and non-voters. And that really offers us this cumulative opportunity. And it's just been wonderful to have the consistency of research with EMC and Dr. T and Ruth specifically at EMC working together, as well as in coordination with our partners at the national and state research initiatives happening, so that we really can fold this all in and move forward to the best recommendations we can. Okay, I'm gonna go big level picture again here. This one's from Elizabeth. Really curious about the government has so much cash finding. What works to avoid that trap? And any thoughts about what those opinions might look like today when even, at least in the wonky spaces, we're talking about the deep impact of public budgets from COVID and shelter in place?
Alina, say the first part of your question just one more time. I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, sorry, I read it kind of funny. The government has so much cash feeling. What works to avoid that trap? And does it look differently now, since at least in some spaces, people are recognizing that COVID means that government doesn't have so much cash?
Yeah, I'll take that one on first, because that was a serious sort of negative disruptor. I mean, just this perception that just government is flush with cash, and we've given this conversation about we've given the government so much money to deal with homelessness, and oh my God, and they flush with cash, but they can't seem to solve it. Came up fairly consistently, whether or not people were on the sort of the more progressive side of ideology, or whether they were on the right, which was an interesting conversation to have. I don't know that it's come up in quite that way. Usually most people assume that government doesn't have the resources, and they assume that's the reason why, and they assume that when you call them forward to this kind of conversation that you're going to be asking them for money, right, in terms of tax dollars, and so they bristle at solving the problem because they think you're going to ask them for more money. And the conversations that we had with folks, they weren't afraid to be asked for more money. They made the assumption that, and you all tell me, I don't know, so this could be the case, that local governments had more than enough money to solve this problem, but that they didn't have the political will to force developers and other privileged folks, right, who were in the space and other communities to accept affordable housing. And so, they didn't have the will, they didn't have the whatever it is, the moxie to do what needed to be done. And so because of that, the Bay Area was suffering. To your second point, you have to get around that. And so, there are two schools of thought, and we could talk about the strategies. That one is to sort of pivot around that, agree to some piece of that, and then get around it. You can say, I agree that money is not the only thing in the conversation today. This is about more than resources. This is about political will. This is about structural racism. This is about whatever those things are. Agree with the idea, the core conception that this is really not just about money, right? Because if you start to try and argue people out of that, then they want to be right. They start to argue about something that is totally irrelevant. That's not even the point that we're trying to make. And so then you get pulled into this conversation that's about government and how much resources they have and what they're spending, and that's not even the conversation we're trying to have, right? So one school of thought is just they pivot around that, agree with what, you're absolutely right. It's not this is not necessarily a money issue. It's bigger than that, right? And then tick off the things that you want to see, because those things really are the issues. So that's one. The other thing I would say is to sort of reframe the conversation based on the values, even with some of what Ruth presented today, that help to have us get back to what is our frame, which is, regardless of what happens in government, this is really about us investing in our future. And so we have to be thoughtful about what that looks like. So I would say reframe the conversation, right, to our values and what we share in common. We both agree that that's right. That's the real issue here. That's a better way to sort of redirect the conversation back. So now you have to somebody's having to argue you out of the future of our children, which is harder to do than to argue about what the resources are in government. I'm happy to hear other thoughts of schools of thought on that if people have other ideas. But from my vantage point, you either pivot around that, away from that, or reframe it back to the frame that is actually winnable for us, and not go down the crazy rabbit trail of, the government has too much money and oh my God, what are they doing with it, which is not helpful.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think one of the things to remember on this issue about people saying that government has too much money, what they're really saying is, I don't like how the government is using my money, and they don't see any outcomes. So what they're really saying is, I don't like, we've been seeing this in San Francisco, right? That I don't want to give more money to homelessness because they don't feel confident that the city's using the money correctly. The same with other issues. When people go to that place of there's no money, or they have plenty of money, what they're really saying is, I don't trust them to be spending my money correctly. So again, I totally agree with Dr. T, we've got to pivot around and talk about outcomes and not get into an argument about how a government, a city, a county, or whoever is using money correctly. We can't get into that back and forth. It's got to be about our values and where we're going.
This reminds me of last week's session when folks were talking about, so what's our tagline going to be? How do we boil down the vision? And Dr. T said, okay, don't be mad, but we might not even say housing in the tagline. It's got to be a bigger vision. And this just really reminds me of how at some point during this research, we were like, wait, are we trying to make people trust government? Do we have to do all that before we can talk about housing? And there's just so many questions about how our work is intersecting with all of these other values. And I've got a two-parter from Stuart in the question box about this, where he says he wants to know what based on what was learned, what's the most effective intersection for allies to support housing? And then the flip side of that, what's the most toxic intersection on that? And I'm going to send that, I think, to Dr. T first, and then let's hear from Ruth.
Okay, what you guys say it again. I was too busy reading the chat.
I know,
I'm guilty. So many good comments.
Your comments in the chat box in the form of a question so we can keep Dr. T focused. All
right, I'll turn off my chat so I can be focused. I'm sorry.
Okay, a two-parter from Stuart. What, based on what you've learned, is the most effective intersection for allies to support housing? And on the flip side, what's the most toxic intersection?
I don't know that I understand the question. Like, in other words, what's the best way to connect our allies to this comment, or what we might call the base, right?
Given the multitude, and Stuart, hop in the chat box and tell me if I'm butchering your question, but given the multitude of issues that are all intersected with our work, we were just talking about how government accountability is part of affordable housing. You've talked about education as part of affordable housing, environment as part of affordable housing. What's the most effective intersection for allies to support housing? Is there one?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, I think that the values really do, as a subset of what's in there, really do give you a key into what's really important to folks. So when you look at those value statements, you know, people's kids, they talk a lot about feeling like their kids have a future, and they're not sure their kids have a future in the day. And that notion of like kids having an opportunity to stay here and be here is huge. And so the connection is to children's opportunity. But I would say the other things, that health and housing conversation, the well-being kind of argument is huge for folks. There is this way in which people talk a lot in those community voice sessions about the craziness of the juggle to try and stay. Like, I'm working this job and I'm going here, and they talk about the impact of that on their own health and stress and that. And so I would say that there's a way in which being able to speak to that sort of health and housing is really important, especially at this moment when you get COVID-19 and a series of other things that are just, you know, right, you know. So all that to say, I think that health conversation is really important. It also, just from an advocacy point of view for our legislatures and our political folks, it also helps to connect us powerfully to the conversations that are ripe and ready for legislators. Like, they're talking about how to deal with COVID-19, they're struggling about healthcare capacity. So when we have that conversation, which we know is resonant with residents around health and how do I maintain my health in this crazy environment in which I'm in, then there's also the same kind of layover that allows us to then have a really powerful conversation with legislators who are also grappling with the same issue. How do we keep people safe, not just for COVID-19, but a whole range of what's happening with wildfires? How do we keep people safe? Right? All of that feels, particularly in this moment, really important. And then the other thing I would say is, this wasn't something that came up in the conversations, the community voice sessions. Our community voice sessions happened before COVID-19 and before all the racial justice stuff started kind of really bubbling up in a different way. But I just feel like at this moment, we have to be connected to that conversation. Like, to me, anybody who's having this conversation about housing and you're not connecting it to issues of racial justice, if you're not connecting it to the liberation of community, it sounds tone deaf. And I know that can be hard. They talk about this conversation of meeting people where they are. Not all people are at that conversation, but I feel like this is the moment, right, to start connecting people up to that conversation. We just have to be very thoughtful about how we do it and how we walk people up to that line so that we move folks in that way. So those are the things I would say are really resonant.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I completely agree that all of these things are interconnected. And so to me, I think one of the biggest things, so we said, I think one of your questions is kind of, what is the worst thing we should do? To me, the worst thing we should do is talk about housing. I think that is actually one of our, and that it's more about community and neighborhood. And when you ask people what do they like about where they live, they usually talk about the people in their neighborhood, the small businesses in their neighborhood, their community, walkable, livable communities, and my neighbors. And I feel like that's what we're trying to draw a picture of, is communities or neighborhoods, or enhancing our communities in walkable, livable places. And we're not just trying to plop a building down somewhere. And I feel like when we talk about housing, it sounds like we're just trying to plop a building down where it doesn't go.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I have a question that I'm going to send to Ruth, and somebody in the chat box already queued you up. Alicia says, the finding that people support production in their own neighborhood is so counter to what we see actually play out when we propose stuff. What's the difference between what they say and what's happening in practice? And then I want to just point out that Gabby from SV at Home said, well, Ruth alluded to people know what they should say, what's the right thing to say, and that might not be how they actually feel. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yes. And I think this has been kind of the constant, and actually some of the battle around both, I will say, this project and some of the other work that we do that would, and some of you know, because I worked with you, I keep, well, what do you want to do? So when we talk conceptually, and one of the challenges constantly has been when we talk conceptually, we see, one, I think people know the right answer. The right answer is, of course I like housing, and of course I want people in my neighborhood. And we see, big, broad support. But then when you are all living with trying to get a specific project approved on a specific corner or in a neighborhood, we see opposition to that. So two things. One, I think that, again, people get confused about what is really going to happen, and people have a hard time visualizing what's going to be in a built community. So any kind of change makes them angry. It's going to change. It's going to be all awful. And, I've talked to folks in focus groups after a project was built, and they say, oh yeah, I really hated it, but now that it's built, it's great having a Whole Foods in my neighborhood. And so, they realize the contradiction, and they oppose it. The other big thing we have to recognize is that the minority can be very vocal. And so when you have a project, and I've worked on many of these with some of you who are watching, that you can get 20% of the whole population is angry about something being built in an area, and they can be incredibly vocal. They can be incredibly motivated, and it might only be 5% of the population. They're the ones that show up at the public meetings, and everybody else, when you've got the 80% that actually are like, I don't care, it'll be fine, they're not going to show up anywhere. And we have to constantly counter that, and I think that's where we have to work to figure out how do we actually let people come out of the shadows as being pro-change, because it's always hard.
And I think that's exactly what we've been asking all along going into this project, is how do we build resonance? Because there's that very vocal opposition. We're not going to move them. What work can we do to really engage the folks who are with us and bring some of those persuadables and bystanders alongside? And I really love, Dr. T, how you named the bystanders, because that's really what they're doing. And this feeds into a question from Rachel that I want to send to Dr. T first. Were there questions in your research that would indicate who it is that's actually likely to support the movement? So like, get rid of the people who aren't with us. And thank you, Dr. T, in the Playbook. You give us some strategies, because you are going to run into those people. So what do you do when they're making noise at a town meeting? But who are the people we really should be going after and bringing to the movement?
Yeah, so that's an important question. And so I want to first just finish up the response to the last question and then get to that one. And in terms of like just what we need to do to pull people forward, my sense is tell them what they win, right? Tell them what they're going to get out of it. Like, what happens is that people think that they're going to lose so much, right? They agree with the notion of affordable housing and what that could do, but I don't know if I don't need directly affordable housing, I don't know what I get out of, right? Coming out to a meeting and throwing my hands up and down, like, where are the people who are going to win? Why aren't they coming out to advocate for what they need? Like, what is happening, right? So then I'm put in a bystander position because it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's about those people. Why aren't they showing up to the meeting, right? And so if you want to bring people to the conversation, tell them what they win, tell them what they're supposed to get. And I think to Ruth's point early on, that's the stuff that you're going to get. It's the community, right? It's all the things that they've been asking for that they feel like that they would like to see reflected in the community that they're not getting. So to your next question about, so how do you know the folks who you can pull forward? It's the folks who are concerned about what's happening in their community, but they're not expressing in a way that's housing. So there's some folks who are already in housing, right? They already think about housing, and so we've got them. But the folks who are deeply concerned about what's happening in their communities, but they may not be connecting those concerns back to housing. So this is why I always say the folks who are concerned about, even when we do community voice sessions, I always ask those questions up front. What are the things that you're concerned about? What are the things that you think about all the time? Talk to me about that. People say, I'm concerned about having, sex trafficking, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on for girls and lots of young men, and I'm concerned about what that looks like in my community, and that's the thing I'm concerned about. Great. If you're concerned about that, then guess what? You have a huge stake in helping us to address what's happening in housing. Because one of the things that makes young people, right, open for predators, right, is the fact that lots of these young folks who need to live independently, cannot find a way to do that without, right, the help of these, folks who are going to take advantage of them. So join our movement, because what you care about is exactly what housing helps us to deliver. So when you're thinking about who we can pull forward, it's the folks who are concerned, have deep concerns about these other issues, but may not be connecting that to housing. And your task is to link those things up so that they see the direct connection. And now they're coming out not only to advocate for, right, bills and things that have to do with, sex trafficking, but also for housing, because they see the connection between those things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. T. I'm looking at some of the questions here, and I don't know that we're going to finish all of these, so I'm going to try to start digging in and grouping them together. And Will, if you're here, I'd love to invite you to join us, because some of these questions are getting a little more into application. Will Valverde is our partner from M&R, who's been really helping us with some of the application forward. We have our strategies, we have our research. What does that look like when we start building out messaging? And part of you coming here is to talk a little bit about what next week's going to be like, but I think some of the best ways we can really tease that out and seed it up is just to stay here with the QAs and start showing where we're going with this. So let me start with you, Will, and I really want to hear from everybody. What are going to be some of the advice or strategies for how to really implement this? Oh, Will, you disappeared. Come back.
Oh no, I'm right here.
Oh, just on my screen then. What advice or strategies can you offer for how do we actually implement this? We've heard the research, we've got the playbook. How do I do this? How do I incorporate it into my own organizational materials, like my website and my newsletter? And that's coming from Khan.
Yeah, so I don't know what's going on with my webcam. So the things that I am really trying to process and trying to figure out how we can make clear and useful for folks in terms of getting messaging points that can sort of be implemented is one, the set of structures that I think Ruth and Dr. T have been talking about this whole time, which is categorizing those audiences who are already with us and need motivating. Those audiences that are maybe not thinking about these issues, and those audiences that are there to cause trouble for us, essentially. And I think we're going to need, in a lot of cases, to have different language and different and elevate different pieces of the stories you want to tell when we're talking to those different audiences. We don't always get to pick and choose which audiences we're talking to, but in your work on an ongoing basis, there are going to be times when you do get to, when you know who you're talking to on average, and being able to sort of customize the messaging points we lean into based on what we're trying to get out of people, motivating them to care more, getting them to think about things differently, or getting them to just sort of hold back on their opposition or rethink it a little bit is going to really change it. The other, I think, structural thing that I really want to be looking at is about scale and about the term that we're talking about, because we have this big vision of where we want the Bay Area to be and where we want housing to be, and that is so far down, like it just, I think it can feel really overwhelming for people. And I know that in a lot of the work that we're doing on an ongoing basis, there's a particular decision we want the local city council to make. And that is a step toward the vision that we have, but there's a different kind of messaging that we're gonna need that is about deflating opposition to this one thing that is happening right now. This is already coming up a couple of times of like, in theory, I like the idea of more housing, even in my neighborhood, and then, but don't actually put that building there. And there's a dichotomy there that I think needs to be addressed when we're actually putting some of these learnings into action.
And so let me take this question a little further, and then I want to get reactions from all three of you on this specific. Isa says, how do I apply the research and playbook to craft a narrative that aligns our values and accomplishes a specific goal of passing rent control? So for example, what do you recommend to the folks on this call if rent control is what they're working on? How do they carry that forward? And let's give Will a moment to catch his breath. Let's go to Ruth and then Dr. T and then Will. And it's okay, you don't have to write the email copy for us. We just want to get your reactions based on
yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges is that we have this overarching narrative, and that it's really important that the overarching narrative is going to be important to try and change opinions long term. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's exactly what we can use in every single situation. So if you have a rent control, if there's a rent control measure in your community that's on the ballot this year or in 2 years, there may be, you know, depending on when it is. If it's this year, we're not going to be able to shift the narrative on all of this. And, you know, we can take some of these, I think there's some very big picture learnings about talking to people about where they are, meeting them where they are, understanding what's important to them relationally, that is related to the issue. But, you know, I also don't want to, it also depends on what you're doing. Are you trying to pass rent control in Berkeley, or are you trying to pass it in, you know, Gilroy or Palo Alto or the Bay Area as a whole, or the state as a whole? Those are all going to be very different strategies because they have to be specific to the situation. So I don't want to just say like, oh, you're going to be able to easily take this and translate it into, you know, certain kinds of wins.
Dr. T?
I piggyback off Ruth, and I would say no easy wins there. But I would say from a case make, I think there are two parts of this. One is having people, what we're talking about is having people lean into a bigger conversation about housing as a thing, even if you don't necessarily say housing is the thing, right? So how do you get people just to say, this is important to me, and to listen up and be willing to sort of get off the fence and get involved in the conversation. The second piece is making an affirmative case for the thing that you're trying to do. So rent control is the thing that you're trying to do. Then what I want to know is, right, what support do you already have? Who are the folks who are continuing to be the bystanders in that conversation, who don't see their stake kind of in it? And then talk specifically about how we bring those folks forward. Who are the, you know, are there some powerful advocates that are already supportive of that, or folks who should be supportive, right? They just don't know that they haven't talked about what their stake is yet. So folks like the hospital folks, like do they have a stake in that conversation? The teachers, do they have a stake in that conversation? Large employers, do they have a stake in who actually would benefit tremendously if we pass rent control, but may not understand kind of how they benefit? And our job is to help them to see that. So it's not an easy thing to say, like, here's the one sentence. It's understanding who you need to bring off that fence and what it is that's of interest to them that would help them to do that.
Well, I don't like to go third because all the smart things were said, but I think yes, I think this is a little bit of getting at of the question of like term and scale, because like as Ruth was saying, the narrative shift is a long-term thing. So presenting that big vision and what it means, I think that's a smaller part of something like, can we pass a rent control ordinance? And so like we want to, that's part of it, but I think this feels to me more like it's an organizing and a targeting question more than anything else. We want to find, it depends on where you are. Again, like if you're in a place where you think you've got already 45% of the people with you, you just need to get that last 5%. You need to find them and probably find a way to motivate them and make it feel like it matters to them, that they will see some benefit. And that's tied to that broader vision of the town or the city you want to live in. But right now it's like, well, you're going to see an immediate benefit next year. There may also be, depending on where you are, an opportunity because there's going to be an opposition to name that opposition, and opportunities there to say like the people who don't want this are the billionaires, and do you stand with them or do you stand with families? So again, drawing some of that sort of us versus them, but it is going to depend on where you are, how and who you're talking to, how much that's going to work.
Yeah, Alina, can I say something too? I just want to, this notion about shifting the narrative is really important because I think we've had lots of conversations at the table about this issue, about the short-term wins and the long-term sort of narrative shift. And so in the short term, there are lots of ways to advance a conversation that can win us the things today. We have to do that. So many of the things that are urgent require us to be successful right now. A great many people are depending on us to deliver, right, on some of the things that are critical to their safety and security, not just in the Bay, but across the country. So there's that. The longer term is in the way I think to think about that is in the longer term, are there some just narratives that are consistently undermining our success that even in the short term, we can be chipping away at, right? We're recognizing that we're not going to get, this was to Ruth's point, you're not going to get that huge like group of folks who see like, oh my gosh, right? This is, how could I have been so silly, right? In 1 year, but over time, as people start to hear the narrative, you start to chip away at some of those larger things. And I want to say in the playbook, there are several of them that I think, well, two things. One, right, let us be very intentional about what narratives we're trying to unseat. What are those dominant narratives that are just, oh my God, can we just get rid of that already? It's killing us. And it just, every time we try to have this issue, right, let's be very intentional about that. And I would say, in the playbook, there are two that are specific, I think, that we're trying to chip away. We may not have all the support that we need on those narratives today, but we're trying hard. One is this us versus them conversation between renters and homeowners, where they're just pitting us against each other, and it's killing us, that conversation. So the more that we can do to bring a sense of we together are both better off if we work together on this issue of what it means to have everybody have a home, right, is really important. And you'll see that throughout the playbook. The other place where I think that the narrative is we're really trying to chip away at those bigger issues is just the equity conversation. Like, no, right now today, we don't have everybody sort of agreeing that equity is is an important part of the housing conversation. But we're trying to say with this narrative, you got to get it in there. We cannot have a housing conversation that does not center issues of equity. That feels really important. And even though we don't have everybody, we're chipping away at that. And over time, the goal is for us not to be having to remind people of that over and over again, but to have that start to regularly be a part of conversation. And I would say there are a number of different dominant narratives that we heard across this body of work that just over time, we're gonna have to knock those down. This conversation about the American dream, and you got to have 2.5 cats and dogs and a white picket fence in a single family home. Like that shit, we have to chip away at that. The question is how we do that in what order, right? We may not be able to get that down today because it's such a powerful narrative that it actually, what's interesting about that is it actually helps people to lead it in the short term on some of the stuff that we care about. So it's hard to knock it down when in the short term, it actually can help us. But over time, we got to get rid of that, right? We got to there's a whole series of them that we know that are just challenging, but we have to. So all that to say, in the playbook, we're targeting those two. There may be others that over time we knock down, but my sense is even in the short term, there are ways to chip away at that stuff. So we're not fighting the same battles, 5 or 10 years from now because we didn't get at some of that.
I'm so tempted in the rent control argument to embrace it and to say these high rents are stealing the wealth that we need to build up so that we can afford to buy a home. Like if home ownership is being hampered by, and that dream is being hampered by these high rents, that we need rent control so that we can embrace home ownership. And it feels like a bad place to be, because we're actually it may be useful to embrace the thing that we don't like, and that is in the short term, and that's a tricky situation to be in.
Yep, you got it.
Well, and I think that's always the challenge in these. What we don't want to do in short-term campaigns is to be counter to where we want to go in the long term.
Yeah, thank you all. There's a number of questions in here that are talking about specific language mediums that we should be using, visuals, all these questions sort of getting to the root of like, what is this going to look like moving forward? And I think even part of the question that Con asked that we didn't answer about like, what are the resources that this initiative is going to provide to help folks do this? Will, can I pass it to you to share a little bit about what folks can expect next Wednesday?
Yes. So yes, and beyond that as well. So that's all the stuff that I'm really excited to get working on. So yeah, so there will be, and we did this a few months ago with sort of the COVID specific languaging. So we'll be building based on all of the work that Ruth and Dr. T and their teams have done, specific language that can be used in specific circumstances when speaking to specific audiences. So walking through some of those actual, like cut and paste this and put it into a press release or into your email messaging. Looking ahead, we have I think a bigger vision for a set of resources that people can use beyond just like sort of an overall messaging guide that will be, I think, partly informed by what you all flag as your needs, in terms of saying we really need to know how we can talk to decision makers, to local legislatures, city councils, state legislatures, whatever it might be. We need visuals that sort of express these ideas in a really compelling way. We need language that we can use in particular media. So that is, I think we are looking to develop sort of a set of resources. There's not going to be like, there's so much here and it's so complicated and so particular to the circumstances that I think we want an overarching set of messaging points and language that can be used. And then we'll be looking to find ways to sort of push further in the directions where where we see a need.
Yeah, so much to come, and we'll get started next Wednesday. And to Will's point, it won't start and stop Wednesday. There's going to be a lot rolling out, and you get to help shape that. You get to tell us what you need, what you want, what is useful. And this has come from the field. This has been shaped by the field. This is going to continue to be shaped by the field, and it's going to be executed and implemented by the field. So we really need to all be doing this together. And the way we can create the best outcomes and deliverables and products is by hearing what's going to be most helpful to you. Oh, great. Thank you, Laundry, so much for dropping that link in the chat box there. So make sure you're registered for session 3 if you have not already done so. And I would love to just take the last 5 minutes to get sort of round robin impressions on one very specific question here, but I think it's something that our community has really taken to heart. This comes from Matt Schwartz. We shifted our language a few years ago. And Ruth, we're going to start with you because I think you were part of this research. We did focus groups back during Prop 46 and 1C housing ballot campaigns. We said, stop saying affordable housing, start saying affordable homes. Is that still true? Does that matter? Is all the weight on that language shift the thing we should be working on?
Oh, I don't know if that was us originally. I think this goes back to what I was saying before about the complication about affordable housing versus housing that is affordable. And I've had a long time, like, I worry that the term affordable housing is so popular that we've gotten ourselves into a trap where we talk about affordable housing. And I don't think, honestly, about affordable homes, I think is maybe a little better, but affordable homes, affordable housing, affordable homes might be, maybe it doesn't sound quite as technical, but that we've gotten into a situation where people use that term, but many people are using that term incorrectly. And I'm not talking about insiders, I'm talking about regular folks, that they don't really know what they are liking. And so, you know, we get into these fights then where one side is saying, I want X percent of affordable housing, and the other side is saying, I want X percent of affordable housing, and where the resident is just saying, I want housing to be affordable. And so, you know, we're kind of fighting over the wrong thing. So I think it's a tough terminology, and I don't have a solution yet for, you know, maybe Will's going to come up with something, you know, of the thing that we're trying to do. But I also feel like affordable housing sounds like that's the end, when really what we're trying to make is making sure that everyone has a home and that communities are generally affordable in places that we can all live and be healthy and happy. And that affordable housing just sounds like a tiny little subset of that.
Yeah, I would just reinforce what Ruth said. Absolutely. I think, you know, saying home is certainly better than housing. So in the context in which you can get away from it, it's not always possible, but in the context in which you can get away from that, saying home is a little bit better. Home is challenging because it does reinforce this kind of very individualistic kind of you know, one individual family in a place, but it is at least something that people actually want. So they want to be in a story or they want to be in a conversation about a home. Nobody really wants to be in a conversation about housing. That's not like, right? That's not a story that you're like, oh, I see myself in housing. No, said no one ever, right? So we're still trying to figure out a way to get around that. I would say in the last round of national research that looked at this question, you know, I think they found the same thing, but they were trying a couple ways at going around this, you know, talking about a place that works for everybody, or a place that is warm. Everybody wants a place that allows for their dreams and aspirations, and that kind of imagery seemed to do better than just kind of naming the housing or home. So I would say, to the extent that you can, start moving away from that language, if you can, right, and giving the imagery around what the vision of what you want people to embrace as part of that is certainly much better.
I know we're running out of time. I have just one quick thing to add to that. And I think it's the ways that there's one way of using affordable housing. If you're a comfortable person who has, maybe you're not wealthy, but you feel like I'm one of the lucky ones. If you're in that lucky category, I got lucky. If you say affordable housing and you understand that to mean housing for somebody else, that means you're going to build something new in my neighborhood and I don't really want that. If you understand that to mean housing that's affordable for me, that means not housing for somebody else. Like, there is a sense of like, either way that you're understanding it, it is leaving out either you or somebody else, and neither one of those is what we want. What we want to do is actually say everybody. It's actually, there's not a either helping other people or helping me. It is together we will have a more livable Bay Area. We will have a more livable community that we can share. And I think that's what I want people to understand. And I feel like whether it's housing or homes, it is still thinking about either it's helping me or it's helping somebody else. If it's helping somebody else, then it's probably hurting me. Neither one. We want people to be in a place of the community is the kind of community that we can all live in.
Oh, thank you so much to the panelists, to the attendees. I know there's questions we didn't get into here. I'm going to stick around and try to offer a couple of notes to some of those questions. And then a lot of them we're going to just take straight into Wednesday because they're really relevant and applicable for there. So please continue to share your notes and your feedback. You can help shape the Wednesday session and everything that comes after it. Do make sure to register for that. And I want to thank Ruth and Dr. T and Will, and in the background, Emily and Landre for helping run today's show. And hopefully I fixed my audio problems. I'm going to usher us out with that NPH Spotify playlist. Thank you all for coming.